Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we continue following James and Diep after one of the hardest decisions of James's life, with his father, Mr. Juan, finally agreeing to let them be together, but only in exchange for deleting all evidence of his crimes. James is left carrying a heavy silence. There's no celebration, no relief. Only the quiet aftermath of a choice that changed everything. As James and Diep begin thinking about their future, they must face the emotional cost of protecting family while sacrificing the truth. Stay with us until the end to see how James and Diep step into an uncertain future together. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The living room doesn't erupt into shouting the way it used to. There is no slam table, no raised voice cutting through the air. Instead, the space sinks into a suffocating stillness, the kind that makes every breath feel heavy and deliberate. The ticking of the wall clock becomes painfully loud, each second echoing like a countdown. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner feels intrusive, as if the room itself is holding its breath. Mr. Juan sits in his armchair, posture straight, hands resting calmly on the polished wooden armrests. His face is unreadable, composed, carrying the quiet authority of a man who has spent his entire life making others bend to his will. Across from him, James stands near the window, arms crossed tightly over his chest, jaw clenched so hard it aches. He hasn't sat down once since entering the room, as if doing so would mean surrendering ground. Diep sits on the edge of the sofa, her back rigid, fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles have gone pale. She can feel the tension crawling under her skin, even before a single word is spoken. Mr. Juan clears his throat. "You want to marry Diep?" he says slowly, his tone calm, measured, almost detached. "I've thought about it carefully." James's heart pounds. He has heard these words before, dressed up in different sentences, different warnings, always ending the same way, with rejection or control. He doesn't interrupt. He forces himself to wait. "I agree," Mr. Juan continues. "You can have the wedding." For a brief moment, James's mind goes completely blank. The words don't register properly, as if they belong to another conversation, another family. Diep's breath catches audibly. She lifts her head sharply, eyes locked onto Mr. Juan's face, searching for sarcasm, for a hidden trap, for anything that proves this is another cruel test. But Mr. Juan's expression doesn't change. "You agree?" James asks, his voice cautious, restrained. Mr. Juan nods once. Yes. The relief James expected never comes. Instead, a deep unease settles in his chest, heavy and cold. His father has never given anything freely. Not approval, not affection, not peace. Every gift has always come with invisible strings. And the condition? James asks quietly. Mr. Juan shifts slightly in his chair, as if adjusting himself before delivering the most important clause of a contract. His eyes remain fixed on James. "All the evidence you've collected," he says, "every video, every audio recording, every document, I want it all erased." The air in the room freezes. James feels Diep inhale sharply beside him. His throat tightens. His chest constricts. He knew this moment would come someday. He just didn't expect it to feel like this. like being asked to cut out his own heart with steady hands. "You want me to delete everything," James says slowly. "You want me to erase the truth." "I want you to protect your family," Mr. Juan replies calmly, "the way a son should." James lets out a short, bitter laugh. "Protect the family by covering up crimes? By pretending none of it ever happened?" Mr. Juan's gaze sharpens, a faint edge slipping into his voice. "By preventing destruction," he says. "If this goes public, everyone loses." Diep stands up slowly. Her voice is steady, but there's a tremor beneath it she can't completely hide. "You're asking him to carry your sins in silence," she says. "That's not protection. That's punishment." Mr. Juan turns his eyes to her, studying her for a long moment. "I'm offering him something no court ever could," he replies. "A future without scandal, without ruin, without his name being dragged through mud that will never wash off." James turns away, running both hands through his hair. His mind floods with memories. Late nights, backing up files, encrypting folders, whispering into phones with supporters, constantly checking over his shoulder. Every piece of evidence came with fear, risk, and the belief that justice was the only way out. And now, freedom stands right in front of him, demanding silence as payment. "You taught me that actions have consequences," James says, without turning back. "Why do you get to avoid yours?" Mr. Juan's voice drops, lower, heavier. "Because I'm your father." The words strike deeper than any threat. James spins around, anger flashing in his eyes. "That's exactly why this hurts," he snaps. "Because you're my father, and you still put me in this position. You force me to choose between my conscience and the woman I love." Silence stretches between them. The ticking clock grows louder, unbearable. Diep feels her heart racing, trapped between the man who raised James and the man James has become. "I did what I had to do to survive," Mr. Juan finally says, his tone firm, unyielding. "Weak men don't last in this world, and strong men don't hide behind their sons." James fires back. Diep steps closer to James, standing at his side. She doesn't touch him, but her presence alone grounds him. It reminds him why he started fighting in the first place. "If I agree to this," James says slowly, carefully, "you stay out of our lives. No interference, no control. You don't make decisions for us ever again." Mr. Juan nods. "Agreed." "And you never hurt Diep again," James adds, his voice hard, unwavering. "Not directly, not indirectly, not through threats or pressure." Another pause, then another nod. "Agreed." Diep looks at James, fear and worry swirling in her eyes. "We don't have to do this," she whispers. "We can walk away. We can start over somewhere else." James shakes his head gently. "I'm tired," he admits. "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of fighting my own father. I just want peace, even if it costs me." That night, James sits alone in a small, dimly lit room. The glow of his laptop is the only light, casting harsh shadows across his face. On the screen, folders are lined up neatly. Months of work, months of fear, months of believing that justice would finally set him free. His hand hovers over the mouse. Deleting these files means no revenge, no accountability, no second chance, just silence. He thinks about his childhood, about growing up under Mr. Juan's shadow, about discipline instead of affection, expectations instead of comfort, love that was harsh, conditional, but still love. "I hate you," James whispers into the empty room. "But I wouldn't exist without you." His phone vibrates softly. A message from Diep appears on the screen. "Whatever you decide, I trust you. I'm with you." That trust hurts more than any threat ever did. James clicks the first folder. Delete. A confirmation box appears. His finger trembles. Confirm. The folder disappears. He moves to the next one. Delete. Confirm. Each click feels like tearing something out of his chest. The anger fades first, replaced by grief. Then comes exhaustion. Finally, a hollow calm settles deep inside him, quiet and unsettling. When the last file vanishes, the screen looks empty. Too empty. James closes the laptop slowly and leans back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He doesn't feel victorious. He doesn't feel relieved. He feels like he has just buried a part of himself. Somewhere else in the house, Mr. Juan sleeps, aware or unaware that his freedom has been purchased with his son's silence. Tomorrow, wedding plans will begin. Smiles will be forced. Congratulations will be spoken. But tonight, James sits alone, mourning the truth he chose to erase. Morning arrives slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the house itself is unsure whether it should wake up after what happened the night before. Pale sunlight slips through the thin curtains, casting long, uneven lines across the walls. James lies awake long before his alarm rings, staring at the ceiling without really seeing it. His body feels exhausted, but his mind refuses to rest. It's as if something essential has been cut out of him, leaving behind a hollow space that echoes with every thought. Then memory comes rushing back, sharp and unavoidable. The folders, the confirmations, the final click. James exhales deeply and sits up on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees. He rubs his face slowly, as if that might help him process what he's done. There's no sudden regret, no urge to undo everything. What he feels instead is heavier and more complicated. A quiet, persistent ache, like grief without a clear reason, like mourning something that never had a proper name. Downstairs, the house is unnaturally quiet. In the kitchen, Diep stands near the counter, holding a cup of tea that has clearly gone cold. She hasn't taken a sip. Her shoulders are tense, her posture stiff, as if she's been standing there for a long time, waiting. When she hears James's footsteps, she turns immediately, relief flickering across her face before she tries to hide it. "You're awake?" she says softly. James nods. "I didn't really sleep." "Me neither," Diep admits. They stand facing each other in silence. There's no argument, no blame between them. Just the shared weight of a decision that changed everything without changing anything visible at all. The world outside continues as normal, unaware of what was erased overnight. "I keep thinking," James says quietly, "that maybe I should feel something clearer, relief, or certainty, something that tells me I made the right choice." Diep steps closer, setting the cup down untouched. "And you don't?" He shakes his head. "I just feel empty." She reaches for his hands and holds them firmly, grounding him. "Then maybe that's normal," she says. "Maybe it means you understood the cost before you paid it." Her words don't remove the ache in his chest, but they steady it, like placing a hand over a wound to stop the bleeding. A little later, Mr. Huan appears in the doorway. He looks the same as always, neatly dressed, composed, controlled. But James notices the difference immediately. His father no longer fills the room with authority. Instead, there's restraint in the way he moves, like a man walking carefully on unstable ground. "We should talk about what happens next," Mr. Huan says calmly. James meets his gaze. Not today. For a brief moment, James expects resistance. He braces himself for it. Instead, Mr. Huan nods once. Very well. That single word feels stranger than any argument they've ever had. Over the following days, life continues in an uneasy rhythm. No one mentions the evidence. No one acknowledges the deal out loud. It exists between them like an invisible contract, binding, fragile, and dangerous to touch. James and Diep move through the house carefully, avoiding unnecessary interactions, choosing silence over conflict. They begin quietly discussing their future, usually late at night when the house is asleep. Not a wedding, not celebrations, just life, where they might live, how independent they need to be, how far they should go to build a life that doesn't revolve around control, guilt, or unspoken debts. James starts looking at apartments online, saving listings, then deleting them, then saving them again. Diep talks about wanting a place with sunlight, somewhere that doesn't feel like borrowed space. They talk about finances, about work, about starting slowly and building something that belongs only to them. But at night, James struggles. Sleep comes in fragments. When he does drift off, his dreams are restless. He sees his laptop screen glowing in the dark, folders perfectly intact, everything still there. Relief floods his chest as he reaches for the mouse, only for the screen to go blank. He wakes up with his heart pounding, his chest tight, the phantom weight of erased truth still pressing down on him. Sometimes he lies awake, staring at the darkness, wondering if silence really is safer than truth. One afternoon, James meets the supporter again. They choose a quiet cafe, far from familiar streets, far from people who might recognize him. The noise of the city hums softly around them, blending into background static. "So, it's really over," the supporter says carefully, stirring his drink. James nods. "It's gone. All of it." The supporter studies him for a long moment. "And how do you feel?" James stares at his coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear. "Like I buried something without knowing if it deserved to stay buried," he finally says. "Like I chose peace over honesty, and I'm not sure which one I'll regret more." "That kind of choice leaves scars," the supporter replies quietly. "I know," James says, "but I couldn't destroy him. No matter what he's done, he's still my father." The supporter leans back slightly. "Just make sure that choice doesn't erase who you are." The words linger with James long after they part ways. As the weeks pass, Mr. Huan keeps his distance. He doesn't interfere with James's work. He doesn't comment on Diep's presence. He doesn't offer advice or criticism. To an outsider, it might look like respect. To James, it feels like a ceasefire, tense, silent, and temporary, without the threat of exposure hanging over him. Mr. Huan has lost his greatest weapon. What remains is a fragile relationship stripped of illusions. There's no warmth, but there's also no open hostility. Just space. One evening, James finds his father standing alone in the garden, staring at the darkening sky. The air smells faintly of damp earth, and the clouds drift slowly overhead. "You're serious about leaving," Mr. Juan says, without turning around. "Yes," James replies. "You always were," Mr. Juan continues. "Serious, determined. That was never your weakness." James clenches his fists. It shouldn't have taken all this to prove it. Mr. Juan finally turns to face him. His expression isn't defensive or angry. It's tired, older than James remembers. "You protected me," Mr. Juan says quietly. James shakes his head. "No, I protected myself and the person I love." They stand there in silence. There's no apology, no forgiveness, just the understanding that some damage cannot be undone, only carried forward.